Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the latest installment of the U.S. Asia Institute's webinar series, Borderless Crime Inside Southeast Asia Scam Compound Crisis. My name is Henry Hong, and I'm a program assistant at the U.S. Asia Institute. For those of you who have attended our events in the past, welcome back. And for those who are new to the U.S. Asia Institute, thank you for joining us. For a bit of background, USAI is a nonpartisan, United Nations recognized nonprofit with a 47-year track record of building understanding and strengthening ties between the people and governments of the United States and Asia. Today's discussion is part of our Southeast Asia in Focus webinar series. Southeast Asia in Focus offers unique insights into U.S. partnerships with Southeast Asian nations through speakers with a firsthand knowledge of global power competition and regional issues. Before we begin, I'd like to recognize our corporate stakeholders, FedEx, Suntory, AIG, Coupang, Aiken, Fairfield Maxwell, Google, and Organon for helping to make programs like this one possible. I'd now like to introduce our moderator, Japhet Quitzon. Japhet is an associate fellow with the Southeast Asia program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. His research interests include disinformation as it affects international democratic institutions, the intersection of trade and digital privacy, and the evolving role of the Philippines in Indo-Pacific security. His work has been featured in The Diplomat, Asia Global Online, and Cambridge University Press, and he is a young leader with the Pacific Forum. Before joining CSIS, he was a research assistant with Dr. Sofal Ear at Occidental College. We are so grateful to have Japhet participating in today's discussion. We've also reserved time to open the floor for general audience questions, so feel free at any time to ask questions you may have using the chat function, and we'll address them during the Q&A portion of our programming. This event will be recorded and posted to the USAI website. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Japhet to say a few words and introduce our panelists.
Thank you so much, Henry, for having us today. I'm very excited to be here and to moderate this discussion on a very, very timely issue. As you mentioned, my name is Japhet Quitzon. I'm an associate fellow at the Southeast Asia program here at CSIS. We believe scam centers are a very timely topic. I'm sure many of you have received strange texts on your phone from an unknown number telling you that you owe money for a toll road, when then you realize, oh, I don't have a car, or oh, I wasn't driving there. Unfortunately, not everyone's so lucky, and we're looking at $21 billion in losses a year from the United States alone, and it's quickly becoming a transnational issue. To help shed light on this issue today, we're joined by two wonderful panelists. We have Dr. Neil Loughlin, a senior lecturer in comparative politics at City St. George's University of London. He specializes in comparative authoritarianism, the political economy of development, and transnational crime in Southeast Asia. Right downstairs from me here at CSIS, I'm joined by my colleague, Julia Dickson, an associate fellow for the Intelligence, National Security, and Technology program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Neil will help walk us through the domestic situation within Southeast Asia, how countries are evolving to meet the scam crisis, and any general developments happening there. And Julia will take a look at what the United States is seeing in terms of the issue and what responses have been happening in the executive branch and legislative branch to solve the issue. We'll have about 15 minutes of prepared remarks from each of them, and we'll open it up to all of you for any questions. At any time, you can put in a question in the chat box below, and we'll be sure to ask our panelists. Without any further ado, I'll hand it over to Neil and Julia.
Thanks, Japhet. Thanks very much, and very pleased to be here with you today, and thank you, Henry, for organizing this. So today, as Japhet said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of sketch a high-level evolution of the scamming industry as it's evolved over the past few years. I'm going to look at how it's scaled in the major countries of Southeast Asia and how those countries have now begun to crack down on it, and the political and economic fallout that's followed. And then I'm going to try and finish by just considering how the industry is now moving, where it's moving, and what this tells us about how adaptable and how global it's become. So the industry came to wider attention really in the late sort of 2010s, early 2020s, when it emerged that particularly the Philippines, Cambodia, Myanmar, and Laos had become the basis for a fraud industry which was reaching victims around the world. As Japhet just said, now scamming Americans, but also citizens globally of billions of dollars annually. Right, so in the early stages, many operations were actually quite small scale, working out of unused office space or apartments, But they expanded very quickly. And you have a situation where cities such as Sihanoukville in Cambodia or places like Shwe Koko in Myanmar came to house large-scale industrial fraud operations in large complexes. And this is the kind of compound model that we're talking about today, right? Or this was the compound model that really scaled and became so well known. Much of this expansion actually relied on infrastructure that was already created during earlier development booms, right? So in Myanmar, you had new city projects in areas on the border close to Thailand, like the Yatai new city. Also in commercial enclaves close to China around the Kokang area. In Laos, this included the Golden Triangle Special Economic Zone. And in Cambodia, it included the whole of Preah Sihanouk, but it's scaled throughout the country. Moving from office blocks, hotels, property developments built during the Chinese investment boom there and the online gambling boom there, which then adapted into these giant complexes and new ones which were also built. And as the scale of the industry expanded, so too did the victim pool. And I'm sure many of you have heard the horrific stories of trafficking and forced labor, which have been documented in these scam centers. Some people who came to work and some people who still do go to work in these scam centers are willing recruits, but many others were trafficked. And even those who've entered voluntarily have often found themselves in conditions that they couldn't easily leave, right? So even if you went voluntary, the conditions were so horrific that actually, you might have withdrawn your consent to work there, but found that you're trapped in debt bondage or other, or forced to stay or coerced to stay. These people who were conducting scams, they were conducting online fraud through messaging platforms, social media, dating applications, and fake investment schemes. And this is the kind of scamming model that we still seeing go on today, right? The so-called pig butchering, which is a romance and trust scam, became very famous. And essentially you have people being tricked to put their money in fake investment scams. When they're then relieved of their money, which is then squirreled away via cryptocurrency. And cryptocurrency and stablecoins have been a big part of this story. Proceeds have then been cleaned and entered legal markets there. Some of you may have seen the arrest in Singapore in 2023, which was kind of an iconic case where you saw lots of people involved in the scamming industry were living the high life in Singapore, but actually various other places where kind of legally dubious capital could be converted into apparently legitimate assets have found scam capital enter there, including London, I should say. So why did this industry then become concentrated in Southeast Asia, right? So geographic proximity with China is an important factor because earlier forms of telecom fraud, which was the precursor to this, originated in Taiwan in the 1990s, then later moved to mainland China in the 2000s. But then it looked to escape to third countries when crackdowns came in those countries, right? So when in Taiwan and then later China, you get crackdowns, they look where else these kind of organized crime groups could move to. And several Southeast Asian countries, they found kind of national or local governments, or in the case of Myanmar, ethnic armed organizations in relations with the Tatmadaw, the Burmese military, willing to host scam-related operations. So the key scam countries of Southeast Asia, they'd built this infrastructure, lots of them, the casino gambling booms, online gambling booms, alongside long entanglements with illicit industries. Again, if you look at Myanmar, for example, the areas where the scam centers took off are areas that have long been involved in the illicit trade, drugs trade, people trafficking, all of these kind of things. So these are places that already had high tolerance of criminal activities, high levels of corruption, and this commingled with a weakly regulated gambling industry, which provided a kind of entry gateway for this scamming to take hold. And so for several years, this was really lucrative, right? This was really lucrative for all involved. But more recently, the industry has come under significant pressure from governments which are really trying to get a handle on it. And this is because the kind of negative political, economic, and diplomatic consequences that the industry caused. And I'm sure, Julia is going to talk more about the US side of this and the sanctions and such like. So let's turn now just to think a little bit about the individual countries which were where it really took off, right? So the Philippines was amongst the earliest country where scamming took hold, but it's also the country which has attempted the most decisive response and has really achieved a meaningful crackdown. So scamming really took off in the Philippines during the Duterte presidency. Duterte came to power in 2016, and Philippine offshore gambling operations, or POGOs, proliferated as part of a policy which sought to welcome offshore gambling. Duterte presented this as contributing to growth and GDP, and it also created substantial rents for developers, landlords, brokers, and politically connected figures in the Philippines, right? So it fed into the Philippine political economy in several different ways. But then the benefits became politically costly as pogo-linked sites became associated with the kind of fraud we've just been talking about, forced labor, corruption. You have escapees leaving compounds, police raids revealing the scale of fraud and impersonation and fraud which is going on here. And these are seemingly protected by local and national political figures. The most prominent case, which I'm sure many people would have heard about, was Alice Gore, who's the mayor of Bamban in Tarlac province, and where there was a large scam compound operating on land in which she'd previously held an interest. She was the mayor of the town, and the scam compound was almost adjacent to the mayor's office. And this raised lots of questions about local protection, immigration control, and all of these things. But unlike Cambodia and Laos and Myanmar, which I'll speak about in a minute, Philippines remains a competitive democracy with the free press and a political system in which public opinion can really kind of impose real costs. And scamming became a highly political, visible political issue. You have investigative reporting, Senate inquiries, which turns POGOs into a national scandal. And by the time Marcos Jr. becomes president, and the industry had become associated with Chinese-linked criminal networks, weak state oversight, and a loss of national control, with Marcos then coming in, trying to portray himself as somebody who's really going to get this ban, get this control on this industry. And this has had a political effect because POGO's expanded under Duterte, and dismantling has allowed Marcos to kind of distance his government from this Duterte-era model of permissive regulation and also Chinese capital. This also comes into the heady mixture where there's been a lot of rivalries between or confrontations between the Philippines and China, maritime disputes. And also as the kind of Duterte administration and the Marcos, or Duterte's and the Marcos families have fallen out, this has become a political issue between the two as as those associated around Duterte, a lot of the POGO issues have been pinned on. So we can see kind of the politics of this all working out as well. But Cambodia followed a different route. So as I mentioned earlier, the scam economy grew out of an earlier online gambling boom, which was mainly aimed at Chinese gamblers. This is a period in sort of the 2010s when you see the city of Sihanoukville, for example, completely transformed to become a kind of real estate property and gambling hub. But then China tightens its controls on online gambling, and Cambodia then bans online gambling in 2019, and a lot of the casino operators then move into online fraud. And this is when the compound model takes hold there. And the Cambodian political economy is very well positioned for these organized crime groups to penetrate it because you have local tycoons and political connected business figures renting land and office space to scam operators at a very large scale. And on the other side, you have individuals who are associated or accused of running scam operations and developing close ties to the government, giving money to government development funds. And in the case of Chen Zhe, somebody who's alleged to have been very heavily involved in scams, actually becoming an advisor at the top level of the government. But the costs in Cambodia have been very significant as well. So Cambodia's international reputation has been deeply damaged by the scams. This is partly why it's been trying to burnish its foreign relations in Washington, which we might speak about in a little bit. But it's also been very embarrassing for the Cambodian government because these figures who've been shown to be very closely associated with figures at the highest levels of the government have faced sanctions, including from the UK and the US. Also, it became an issue between Cambodia and China. China and Cambodia have very close relations, and also pressure within ASEAN as people and elsewhere as governments have been labeling Cambodia as a trafficking risk for their citizens. There's also been a massive economic fallout. Tourism, which is a major engine of Cambodia's economy, has all but collapsed, and legitimate investment is down. And this is all at the time for Cambodia, you know, when the Strait of Hormuz is closed, tariffs, global inflation, which is severely hitting Southeast Asian economies anyway. And Cambodia has also hit its international reputation at a time when it's engaged in a simmering border conflict with Thailand at the moment. And Thailand has been able to frame part of its part in the conflict as a way of shutting down the scamming industry, bringing journalists to look at scam compounds in areas that it's captured from Thailand. And this has prohibited Cambodia really from internationalizing the conflict in the way it might have liked to and the way it previously had done. And so Cambodia has more recently really begun a widespread crackdown on the scam centers. But this has created a new headache because there's a situation where there's hundreds of thousands of people in Cambodia who were previously working in scam centers who fled and they now don't have passports. There's a humanitarian crisis. They don't have food or money or shelter. So you have a human tragedy, but this is also a PR disaster for the Cambodian government as well, because media organizations are starting to highlight now the situation in Cambodia for these people who have been left destitute, many of whom are at risk of trafficking, and there's evidence that some are being re-trafficked to other areas, including in Myanmar. Myanmar is another area, and I don't have much time, I don't think, to speak about Laos, but just to speak a little bit about Myanmar is another place where scamming became a really important part of the economy. There, the compound economy really became enmeshed in its fragmented border politics. And you might see a trend here with how scamming operations really mesh and link into pre-existing political economies, right? They've kind of followed the contours of the political economies of the places in which they've operated, even though the actual scamming model is quite unified. So if authority in these borderland areas is shared between the Myanmar military, border guard forces, militias, ethnic armed organizations, and these are groups that control land, checkpoints, roads, local security, border crossings. And this has allowed them to kind of monetize the areas they control and allow scamming to happen there. And again, initially this was lucrative. It provided funds for border guard forces at a time when the civil war was really ramping up, and actually the forces aligned with the Tatmadaw, with the Burmese military, were not doing so well. It also fed into kind of corrupted political economies around different criminal families that controlled different areas in Myanmar. But again, some of the wheels began to fall off more recently, right? On the one hand, there's been incredible pressure from China, which has a lot of influence over the Myanmar military, but also the borderland areas like Kokang, where it's had lots of influence for a long time. Also, some of the groups fighting in the civil war were able to present some of their operations as actually designed to crack down or launched against scamming operations. So you've seen now an effort on the part of the Myanmar military to really get a handle on the scams. They've demolished some of the scam compounds, but there's lots of evidence that it's moving within Myanmar into different places, and it hasn't gone away completely. As I say, I don't have a lot of time to speak about Laos, but I'm happy to speak about that in the Q&A if anybody wants to ask there. But again, it kind of follows the contours of the political economy there in the kind of enclave governance that they have. So what we can see really is that what proved to be a very lucrative industry is still making money for lots of people involved has caused a lot of headaches now, and lots of these governments are trying to get a handle on it. It's been a real issue for the public relations and of lots of governments. You know, Cambodia has really struggled now to present its image as anything other than a really corrupt country. And at the same time now, we see the scam organizations and operations moving out of Southeast Asia as they try and hedge their bets and move to kind of avoid some of these crackdowns. And this is kind of the last thing that I want to speak about. So it's wrong to say that the industry has disappeared from Southeast Asia, but it is moving to other places. So Sri Lanka is one recent example. So reports have indicated that some networks from Southeast Asia have moved there, but as seems to be becoming the trend, the operations are generally smaller than the compounds in, say, Myawaddy in Myanmar or Sihanoukville in Cambodia. You're seeing more the use of rented apartments, hotels, beach resorts, office buildings, kind of a bit like what you saw before the compound model took place in Southeast Asia. Sri Lanka offers affordable property, digital connectivity, easy visas. It's relaxing its gambling rules. But there does seem to be now an effort on the part of the Sri Lankans to crack down on some of these operations faster than has happened in Southeast Asia states. Timor-Leste is another place that some of these have been taking root. West Africa is also becoming an important hub. So there was raids recently in Lagos and Abuja, which identified Chinese, Filipino, and other foreign nationals working alongside local actors in office buildings and residential properties. And this model we're seeing involves some levels of trafficking, although doesn't seem to be on the enormous scale that we saw in Southeast Asia of hundreds of thousands of people, but we're almost seeing a more bespoke model of scamming. And this tells us that the industry is changing. It's gone from this kind of city scale scam economies that developed in parts of Southeast Asia. And I think these are going to be difficult to reproduce because they really rely on particular conditions, political conditions, winning governments and governments willing, at least initially, to take this level of international scrutiny. So what we're seeing now is smaller operations. These are becoming more important, working from villas, and this is how the industry seems to be evolving. It seems to be becoming more diverse, more mobile, and this may make it harder to identify because you don't have these physical compounds on massive scales, which people who do open source investigations and journalists were so adept at showing had taken over large parts of the territory in these countries. And so this is really where we are today. I think I'll leave it there and I'll pass to Julia, but I look forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
All right. Hello, everyone. I want to start by thanking the US Asia Institute for having me and for putting this together, as well as Dr. Loughlin for his comments. He provided such a great and comprehensive background on what the situation looks like on the ground in Southeast Asia. I'm going to pivot and focus my comments a little bit on how the United States is responding to this growing threat. For context, as Japhet mentioned, Americans lost nearly $21 billion to fraud in 2025, according to the FBI's Internet Crime Report. In 2025, roughly 1 in 5 Americans reported losing money to an online scam, and of those who lost money, roughly 30% said it hurt their personal finances a great deal or a fair amount. These statistics are probably a wild underestimate of the true losses, as many people don't report scam losses, and those who do don't do so to the government, but rather report to their financial institution. Not only is this industry causing financial and psychological harm, but it's also a national security threat to the United States. As Dr. Loughlin mentioned briefly, a lot of this money is flowing to corrupt actors in Southeast Asia, corrupt officials that are harming U.S. interests, contributing to democratic backsliding and undermining regional stability and the rule of law in Southeast Asia. Additionally, many of the same actors that are involved in scams are also involved in other forms of illicit activities, such as arms trafficking, drug trafficking, and of course, the human trafficking component. Fortunately, over the past 3.5 years that I've been working on this issue, I've seen a major shift in the awareness as scam losses have skyrocketed. Especially over the last 8 or so months, the US government has demonstrated an awareness of the issue and a resolve to tackle the threat. So that's a really positive change. Starting primarily in last October, for example, one of the first major moves was that the US and the UK imposed sanctions on 146 targets within the Prince Group, including a scam kingpin, who was a special advisor to the Prime Minister of Cambodia. The pressure that this put on the Cambodian government, combined with Chinese pressure, led to the extradition of Chen Zhe to Cambodia, and since Cambodia has conducted thousands of raids on scam compounds. While it remains to be seen the overall effect that this is having on the scam industry, as Dr. Loughlin noted in his comments, it is causing it to shift and the industry is highly adaptable. The pressure is clearly having an impact. Since these sanctions in October 2025, we've seen continued action from federal agencies, the White House, and from Congress. On the agency side, the main effort to date is the Scam Center Strike Force, which was founded in November of 2025. It's a multi-agency initiative that includes the Department of Justice, the FBI, the Secret Service, the State Department, and the Treasury. And to date, the Strike Force has seized more than $725 million in crypto from scams. In 2 examples of their work, just a few weeks ago, the Strike Force announced an operation in partnership with private technology companies and foreign allies. In this operation, they disrupted more than 1.4 million social media and email accounts, arrested 7 scammers in Thailand, and decommissioned infrastructure linked to scam networks operating throughout Southeast Asia. Back in April, in another operation, the Strike Force announced criminal charges against Chinese nationals who managed a scam compound in Myanmar, the seizure of a Telegram channel used to traffic victims to scam compounds in Cambodia, and the seizure of 503 fake investment websites. We're also seeing direct action from the executive branch. On March 6th, alongside the launch of the National Cybersecurity Strategy, President Trump signed Executive Order 14390, which is titled Combating Cybercrime, Fraud, and Predatory Schemes Against American Citizens. The whole point of this executive order was to direct agencies to tackle the scam crisis. Specifically, it directs the Attorney General and the Secretaries of State, Treasury, War, and Homeland Security to assess current frameworks to prevent cybercrime and scams and make recommendations for how to improve them. Within 120 days, these agencies are required to submit an action plan, and that deadline is actually approaching pretty rapidly. It is on July 4th, or our Independence Day, so I'm pretty eager to see kind of what these agencies come up with, and I think that'll be a really good and informative step to see how the government is going to tackle it. It's a very important step towards a coordinated whole of government strategy, which the US hasn't quite had till this point. Additionally, yesterday, in furtherance of this executive order, the Treasury sanctioned 9 entities and 26 individuals linked to the Prince Group, which built on the October 2025 sanctions that were in coordination with the UK, as I previously discussed. In addition to the executive branch, we're also seeing Congress take action. Especially since late 2025, we've seen a large number of bipartisan bills introduced in multiple congressional committees. And in the House, a bipartisan group of representatives launched the Stop Scams Caucus that aims to protect Americans from financial fraud and cyber scams. As Congress builds on what the executive branch is doing, lawmakers should focus on 4 urgent priorities. Number 1, information sharing. Congress should consider reviewing and updating the legal authorities that companies have to share actionable scam intelligence both with each other and with the government. Right now, a core problem is that every company only sees one piece of the puzzle, so that hinders their ability to work together. Second, standardized reporting. As it is now, data is scattered between multiple agencies. So you can report to FBI, you can report to FTC, Treasury's FinCEN also has a stake in the game, as well as many people report to the private sector. So we need a streamlined ecosystem to aggregate reports from both the private sector companies and individual scam victims. This will give the US government a better picture of the entire landscape and enable them to understand emerging trends as they come and then act rapidly. Third, Congress should consider how to support less well-resourced entities. Currently, smaller companies and local police departments don't always have the resources or training they need to prevent and recognize scams. Congress should therefore consider providing grants or training programs to bridge that gap. And finally, victim relief. Right now, if an American under the age of 59 and a half withdraws funds funds from their 401k as part of a scam, they have to pay early withdrawal penalties as well as taxes on money that was literally stolen from them. So Congress should consider eliminating this penalty for scam victims. As the United States ramps up these domestic efforts, it must also work with and learn from our allies. Countries like Australia, the United Kingdom, and the members of the European Union are all grappling with this exact same crisis, and cybercrime is truly borderless, so it's critical that we work together. Australia is a really great example of this. It has moved quite quickly to address scams and has been successful in bringing down the rate. The country launched a single agency that has authority over this in mid-2023 called the National Anti-Scam Center. And the center also runs the Scam Watch reporting service, which is a centralized website where Australians can both report scams and access resources and information about scams. It's a very interesting model for the US to look at and consider as it pursues its own strategy. Overall, I'm incredibly encouraged to see how the recognition of this problem has shifted since I first started studying it about 3.5 years ago. The awareness is finally here, but where we're at now is the hard part. We actually have to implement these changes. If we want to successfully dismantle these global syndicates, the United States has to leverage every tool in our arsenal in a coordinated way. Thank you so much. I'll leave it here, and I look forward to your questions.
Great. Thank you both so much. As discussed earlier, please start asking any questions in the chat box right down there. But I will take my moderator's privilege to ask you both a couple questions before we hand it off to any of you who have any questions. So I'll start with Neil. You mentioned something very interesting, that Cambodia's PR has taken quite a big hit from this, right? I've been seeing all over social media feeds, especially in the context of the border conflict, with aggrieved Thais calling Cambodia Scambodia, for instance, in the wake of the conflict. I've been reading a report saying something about Cambodia's efforts to improve lobbying efforts in other countries to try and rehabilitate this reputation of theirs. How do you think that might affect their strategy moving forward? Do you think this will be effective, or do you think this is just a band-aid on a far deeper issue?
I think it's it's definitely a band-aid on a far deeper issue. If you look at so you have a situation where various ministers and officials from the Cambodian government are going around trying to improve their reputation, because their reputation is in the pits. It's in a terrible state at the moment, and it has been for a long time. Because if you look back, so I first started working on Cambodia in sort of the in around 2010. And since that time, you've had the collapse of even the semblance of democratic competition in the country, the banning of the former opposition party, the CNRP, the imprisonment of its leadership or self-exile. So already it was starting at a pretty low base, right? And then all of a sudden you have added into this already pretty poor mixture, which had already resulted in tariffs being raised against Cambodian garments and such like from the EU, and or the removal of preferential tariff agreements. And just as Cambodia was trying to rehabilitate its reputation, you have US military visits, for example, to Ream Naval Base, starting to try and come out from the cold a little bit, and maybe seem to be maybe a little bit more of an interest in re-engaging with Cambodia by the US and others. You now have this scamming situation, which looks terrible. Right, and it touches upon, not to say that those who have been implicated are all guilty, but it touches upon people who are close to the Cambodian government, and you have the sanctioning of people who are actually members of the ruling party, right? So Leon Pat, for example. So yeah, they've got a lot of work to do to try and rehabilitate their reputation. But I don't think it's going to be very successful because you now have this terrible humanitarian crisis, as I mentioned, going on in Cambodia, which looks awful because it's really shown the heartlessness of this industry, and also now the heartlessness to those who've been stuck in it, right? So there's no assistance really. There's very little assistance for these people. Although I do see now that the Cambodian government is trying to portray and say that it is trying to help some of these people, of which it may be doing somewhat, but it's in no way near sufficient to the problem. So yeah, I think it's going to be a very long road back to respectability for the Cambodian government.
That sounds about right. The human cost is very hard to ignore on both sides for these sorts of situations. So thank you for that. Julia, I wanted to touch on something you mentioned in your remarks. You said it was critical that we work together, right? And you pointed at the example of Australia's coordinated responses to the issue. From your perspective, other than what you've outlined, what do you imagine US engagement on the international stage to look like, working with partner countries to try and solve this cohesively as a collective unit?
That's a really good question, Japhet. So I'm hoping that the action plan that comes out as a result of the executive order kind of outlines the US strategy for that. I think it needs to be clear, coordinated, and consistent. So right now we've seen sort of sporadic law enforcement operations with different countries. So in April, the FBI, the Dubai Police Department, and the Chinese Ministry of Public Security worked together to arrest 276 individuals and to dismantle 9 scam centers. But this was sort of a one-off event. So we need something that is a bit more consistent and regular. Same thing with the joint sanctions. So as I mentioned, the US and UK had sanctions against the Prince Group in October, and I think that implemented a good amount of pressure on the Cambodian government, but we need to see that more consistently. And then the last thing I'll say about US support is just simply that the dismantling of USAID has had a pretty large impact. We've seen civil society organizations that were funded by USAID lose that funding, and they are a key source of information about what's going on in the region. And without that funding, we may lose visibility into some of the on-the-ground realities. So that is certainly a concern that has arisen for me.
Losing visibility would be very difficult in a space where it's already so difficult to track all of the developments as they are. So very great points there indeed. I'm starting to get some questions here from the audience, and so I'll start passing them over to both of you. We have our first question from Oren Richards, who is curious to know what measures the EU is taking to address scams. Are there other countries other than Australia that provide strong models for anti-scam programs?
I can start on that one, and then Neil, if you want to jump in. So Australia was probably one of the first countries to really make inroads in this way. They've been sort of ahead of the curve on everyone, perhaps because it's sort of in their local neighborhood a little bit more than it is for the rest of us. The EU is starting to act. The European Commission, I think about a month ago, just worked to strengthen Europol authorities to combat digital threats. And so they are making inroads in that way, but they're not yet to the same level that Australia is.
Yeah, I think Julia's answered that pretty comprehensively, but yeah, just to say that there does seem the sanctions that we've already mentioned show the kind of coordinated effort between the UK, for example, and the US, and this is making a real difference. And just to echo Julia's point about USAID, as a non-US citizen, it's very interesting to see what in this new era we should, as whatever we call it, what US leadership, such as it is, looks like on these issues. You know, what the replacement of USAID with, I can't remember, America First. I can't remember the name of what it is called now, but what does that look like to deal with an international issue, right? But it does seem on the ground there is real coordination still going on, which is very heartening, you know, in the form of these sanctions and such like. So it is interesting to see. But yes, civil society organizations, including those which I used to work with in Cambodia, who used to be funded by USAID, are in a terrible state now. And it's you know, it's very sad to see, because these are precisely the organizations which would have been doing victim support that no longer can. And some of the big internationals who can't or don't do it to the same extent. They're worried about their mandate relations with the government and such like, which might make it more difficult. These smaller organizations which receive small but very meaningful amounts of money from USAID used to do this kind of stuff.
Yes, the loss of that funding certainly seems to have many widespread effects that we didn't necessarily foresee in the beginning, but thank you. I'll move on to our next question. We've got one from Tien Tai Pham asking how the expiration of Section 702 would affect the United States government's ability to identify and monitor transnational scam compound networks operating in Southeast Asia. Sounds like a Julia question.
Yeah, so 702, for those of you who don't know, is referring to 702 of FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, I believe. And basically what that allows US intelligence agencies to do is access the data of non-US persons that may pass through US infrastructure. So it came about after 9/11. Ooh, that's a really good question, how it would affect this. So I think it will have an impact on the way that the US government is able to look at what's going on US telecoms infrastructure. So there is quite a good amount of this that's passing through US infrastructure. And so it might limit their ability to look at that. But I think for the most part, because this is all sort of occurring overseas, it's not really an issue that touches 702.
Got it. Thank you. I actually have a follow-up question for you just because of something that just happened in my message inbox just a couple minutes ago. I just got a spam message, scam message even, asking if I would be interested in any matchmaking programs, for instance. I don't think so. And I think a lot of these messages are looking increasingly similar, increasingly mass manufactured, which begs the question, the elephant in the room with scam centers, AI. To what extent do you think it's changed the way that these cyber scams are being carried out?
So I would first say that it's lowered the barrier to entry. So you don't have to be fluent in a language now in order to communicate with that person. You don't have to be fluent in a certain country's cultural customs or conversation norms in order to be able to have a very convincing conversation. And so I think in a lot of ways, it's just allowed them to send more authentic sounding scam messages quickly. So that's one way that platforms, kind of like ChatGPT are changing the game. Another way would be deepfake technologies. So scammers are now able to use deepfake technology to generate photos of like their fake persona. So you could have a man who says, "Oh, I'm, a Russian woman," and they can generate a photo of a Russian woman basically and send it in a very convincing way to trick people into, falling for that sort of romance scam. They also can use it to impersonate like famous people. So that's something we've seen, to even impersonate loved ones. And so you could get a scam call that's a mother thinking it's her son asking for money, and that's pretty convincing and quite scary if you think your child is, in a bad state. So those are some of the ways we've seen. Another piece of technology that is emerging as a concern is going to be malware. We've seen a large malware as a service trade occur through channels like Telegram, where basically you don't have to have any sort of technical knowledge, but you can buy this technology. One thing they're buying is spyware, so they can get a victim basically to install this onto their phone, and they can gain access to their camera, their photographs, their contacts, their notes, microphones, and other biometric data, which then can be used to either, get into their bank accounts and steal money. It can be used for blackmail in some cases, like sextortion, if they're able to convince them to partake in a compromising call or steal compromising photos. They can threaten to send them to their contacts if they don't pay money. So that's another technology that is being used and being exploited by these scammers. That's definitely a concern.
That's quite scary. Thinking about the deepfakes, I heard a demo on how convincing the voices can sound, and that's what I kind of thought of pretty instantly when you talked about the deep personal potential for this, like family situations, impersonating parents, impersonating kids. Quite scary new territory we're getting into. We're going to turn back to the audience for this next question from Isabella Collins. The question is about US-China relations. China has its own active anti-scam campaign in Southeast Asia, but it seems more focused on protecting Chinese victims and expanding Beijing's security footprint than actually shutting down the networks. Do you think there's any realistic basis for US-China cooperation here, to any of you?
Yeah, I'm happy to take this one initially. I think it's a misunderstanding that, different governments are most interested in protecting their own citizens, right? And this is what the Chinese are doing. But the crackdowns under Chinese pressure have been real, right? There's been sustained pressure. So I don't think it's the case that there's a not real interest, because it's Chinese citizens who, for the large part, are being scammed, right? Or for a long time were being scammed. And a lot of this doesn't discriminate on ethnicity or nationality, right? These scam compounds are trying to scam whoever they can. There was some talk about this idea of patriotic scamming, but I don't think that's really, I think that's been proven to have perhaps been more isolated incident than actually the norm. So I do think the Chinese have worked pretty hard to get a handle on this, because it's impacting their own national security, their own citizen interest, defrauding their own citizens, like US and UK and other citizens, have been defrauded of billions of dollars. So I do think that the Chinese influence has been meaningful. And of course, this also impacts China's reputation globally as well, when it's organized crime groups, which are a lot of them Chinese origin, are implicated in scams. It doesn't do well to have these abroad. It undermines Chinese investment. It undermines Chinese reputation and all of these things. So there's a big impetus there, and we've seen the pressure that was put on China by China on Myanmar, for example, to crack down on the scam zones on the Chinese border. So I do think it's having an impact.
Great, thank you. Anything to add, Julia?
No, I would pretty much echo what he said. I think China's pressure has been real. I think he's correct in that most citizens are most interested in protecting their own citizens. And while, we hope that China will also use that pressure to help protect people elsewhere, it does kind of make sense that that's been the general trajectory. And I think we need to keep trying to work with them and, calling out maybe when they don't do as much as they can, as we should with all countries.
Definitely.
Yeah,
it's such a
I
key
think
area
Julia's
for
got a point.
opportunity.
I think Julia has a good point on calling them out as well, because there was a lot of foot dragging on the part of the Chinese potentially because of their bilateral relations with Cambodia, for example, is very close. But it did seem that it went too far. And there was pressure for a long time by the Chinese. So yeah, I do think, and there is work to potentially to work with the Chinese, although that's very difficult.
Let's hope for some good progress moving forward. We've got our next question from Professor Min Kim. Curious to know, how does an expansion of scam centers in war-torn Myanmar altered, if any, rebel operations and governance in affected areas?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think it's been pretty meaningful the way it's impacted rebel operations. The classic example is Operation 1027, which was portrayed as, by the Three Brotherhood Alliance as an operation to bring down the scam operations in Lukai, right? On the other hand, and feeding into this, a lot of the border guard forces who are involved, like the Karen border guard forces, have been funding some of their operations or have been funding their existence through scamming operations. Some of this money apparently is being kicked back to the Tatmadaw, the Myanmar military. So it's been very consequential. Again, with the criminal operations around Kokang, this was scam money. So it's been incredibly consequential. And there's a question now about if this scam crackdown is real and meaningful, what's it going to be replaced by? Because at the same time, you're seeing an uptick in opium production, methamphetamine production, the things which have typically funded the different rebel organizations, or some of the rebel organizations. Not all of them are involved. So yeah, it definitely feeds into it. It's a great question.
Constantly evolving front over there. And the more I learn about the different entanglements in scam centers and other illicit things, it becomes even more of a patchwork of things to tackle when it comes to the situation in Myanmar. Our next question keeps us in the region from Erica Tolfo, who asks, the Philippines stands out as the only democracy among the countries we've discussed. Could Neil speak a bit more about how scam networks have become so prolific there despite that? Are there any specific factors that allow these operations to take root and grow in a democratic context?
Yes, I mean, corruption, as we all know, can happen in a democratic context. And also, if you look at the very nature of Philippines politics, I mean, if you look at McCoy's books, for example, you'll see that criminal industries have permeated Philippine politics for, generations. You have, gambling vice economies. The first Marcos regime was deeply implicated with lots of criminality. And then if you look at, Duterte elected democratically, but then, some police have suggested that some of the kickbacks from pogos were then used to reward police in the violence used against, suspected drug users or those accused of using drugs and were murdered. But I also think the other side of the coin is that the Philippines has been able to get a handle on this better than lots of other places. On the one hand, as I mentioned in my comments, it really has become enwrapped within the kind of network politics of the Philippines. What was sometimes called cacique politics, sometimes called bossism, whatever label people want to put on it, and the kind of politicking between the Dutertes and the Marcos groups. I find Philippine politics endlessly fascinating. It's like a soap opera, but in real life. It's endlessly fascinating. And but also you see these Senate investigations, this amazing work that's been done by Rappler, the free press, that you have in the Philippines, which you don't have in these other places, which really helped hold these operations to account and expose what was happening earlier. And then the fact that the Philippine public were able to exert so much pressure on their representatives to crack down on it, that you have people who've really come to prominence in the Philippine political situation and the Philippine political context because they're willing to take on these scamming networks, using it to then bolster their own image. So on the one hand, corruption can always happen in democracies, a Philippine context. Just look at Estrada, for example, and criminality associated with gambling and all sorts of things. But on the other hand, this democracy was and free press and the elements of liberal democracy, which are important, really were part of the reason why the Philippines has been able to get a crackdown on it, to get a handle on it, sorry, and crack down early.
I totally agree with you. It definitely is like a soap opera, and it's what keeps it endlessly fascinating to me as well. Tracking every little development in Philippine politics is really you just can't stop taking it in. So I get where you're coming from. I'd like to move a little to the mainland. You mentioned Laos very briefly, also an integral part of the Scam Center ecosystem. Could you touch a little bit more on what developments you're seeing within the country over there with the Golden Triangle region, and what attempts the government may be making to push against scam centers in the way that maybe its neighbors are or aren't?
Yes, I mean, I feel guilty because Laos always gets left out of these conversations. But Laos is also a place where we've seen a crackdown, right? So scamming in Laos is mainly concentrated around the Golden Triangle Special Economic Zone, although there is some others in some provinces, in the south, for example, on a smaller scale. But yeah, it really happened around this special economic zone, which is linked to Jiaowei, who's has a special economic zone there since the kind of mid-2000s, a place which is synonymous with human trafficking, wildlife trafficking, various types of criminality, people trafficking, child sex abuses, awful things, terrible things. But what he seems to have been given there was kind of an enclave to really kind of do what he wanted with the area, right? He was awarded a medal for assisting the police or something in 2024 at the height of the scams. But yeah, if you go to the Golden Triangle Special Economic Zone, the area really is an enclave, a Chinese enclave in Laos, essentially. But now the pressure has gotten a lot. There does seem to be a crackdown happening there, but then we're seeing by the nature of where the Golden Triangle Special Economic Zone is in the Golden Triangle, you're seeing lots of people now move to other parts of the Golden Triangle, like Tachilek, in Myanmar, for example, which is quite close to there. Also, some of the people who were allegedly providing security associated with the United States War Army and others have moved into other areas. So there does seem to be a crackdown going on there. There are reports there that it's a ghost city compared to what it was. So it's another place where there's a crackdown going on. But again, you're just seeing this movement of the scamming industry in the region and elsewhere. So it's all part of this picture.
Yeah, that mobile aspect really is what makes it difficult. They can move anywhere. And like you mentioned, it can be a rental apartment, it could be a hotel, it could be an abandoned office building, you name it, they can be there. Definitely quite frightening. Moving also into the mainland, we have a question from Max Eads asking about Thailand. How is Thailand handling the human trafficking issue within these scam centers? People being taken into Myanmar, then making them work at scam centers, for instance. And how has the Thai government been holding these actors accountable?
Should I take that one again? Yeah. Okay, so Savannah Airport, for example, was a major hub of trafficking to get people through, and these people then were trafficked over to, the Shui Koko and the border. So there's a lot to suggest that people within immigration or wherever would have had to have been involved or turning a blind eye. There's also been reports of people at the highest levels of government or connected to the highest level of government have been some ways involved. And I always want to be careful with how I frame this of very, litigious people. But there does seem to be an effort to get a hold on this. So, for example, the Thais turned off the electricity to Myawaddy, for example. They are putting a lot of pressure on the Cambodians at the border using this scam issue to, bolster their argument in the conflict. And so there does seem to be a effort to get a handle on it, but people are still ending up in these compounds and people still seem to be being trafficked. So there's definitely more work to be done. But there's also the case that, personally, I've spoken to some Thai police and others who have been very interested and working hard to get a handle on this industry as well. So yeah, there's two sides of that coin.
I would just add,
Oh no, go on. Sorry.
just as I think awareness of Thailand's role in the trafficking aspect has grown, it's also been a reputational risk for them, which then has harmed their tourist economy, which is quite large. So I think that's also motivating some of the action, which is positive.
Sticking to Thailand, for our last question, I'd want to hear from you both on what you believe the recent Thai-Cambodia border conflict has done to affect scam operations and what the current relationship of the two countries are. This is from Karina Mori.
I can start. So I'll say that in the most recent border conflict, Japhet and I actually wrote a piece about this. So if you're interested, you can find it on the CSIS website. But essentially, Thailand was bombing scam compounds located within Cambodia, and they used this as a sort of nationalistic narrative to say we're, fighting against what they call Scambodia. And then on the flip side, Cambodia sort of used this border conflict to portray itself as a victim and try to build back the relationship with the United States. So it served sort of different interests on both sides.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Julia's covered that pretty well. I think it's fed into this conflict in a whole bunch of ways. I mean, at the time of the conflict, there was a lot written that maybe the conflict was partly down to scams. I don't think the scams were a useful adjunct to it. But it's definitely really helped the Thai case, at the time when they're using, pretty heavy weaponry against the Cambodians and in a conflict which the Cambodians are not blameless, of course. This has helped its international image, I think, because it can say that, and they're actively taking journalists to compounds there. And there has been a move on by the part of the Cambodians actually to crack down on some of the scam compounds around Poi Phet and the areas which are adjacent to or border Thailand. And, you know, if you go on Telegram or if you go on Facebook, you can see these hideous videos of pitched battles between the Cambodian police and criminal groups on the border as they're emptying out these compounds. So this is one of some of the areas where we're really seeing crackdowns. Initially, it looked like some were moving more to the Vietnamese border, but it looks more like there's a meaningful crackdown nationwide now. So yeah, I do think it has an influence, and in the sense that it was also an impetus for Cambodia to try, and as Julia was saying, rehabilitate its image as well as this conflict, which has not gone very well for the Cambodians, you know, losing territory, which is, you know, in Cambodian nationalist discourse, one of the worst things that can happen. You know, you even had the former Prime Minister Hun Sen saying that, you know, it was my fault this conflict hasn't actually gone well recently, which was kind of crazy for me to see somebody who's been following Cambodia for a long time. I don't think I've ever seen him admit fault of anything. But yeah, it is something that the Cambodians really have to get a grip on.
I'd second you there. I don't think I've ever heard Hun Sen say he was at fault for absolutely anything at all. So with that, I wanted to thank you both so much for your insight. I always learn a lot, especially in scam centers, especially with how it affects the region. It's a very complicated web of issues, and I'm glad that we got to hear from you both to shed more light on a very complicated situation. Thanks to you all for joining us and for taking the time to attend. I'll turn it back over to Henry for any final remarks.
Yeah, well, that was such a great discussion. I really learned so much, and I'm sure our audience did as well. I'd like to extend our thanks to all of our speakers here for taking the time out of their very busy schedules to share their expertise on this very timely topic, and to our audience for your participation. While we're out of time for the briefing portion of today's event, if you would like to follow up with any of our of today's speakers, please reach out to us, and we would be happy to assist in further fostering dialogue on the issues discussed today. As a reminder, this webinar is recorded and will be posted on our website, USAsiaInstitute.org, where you can also learn more about future USAI events and webinars. Thank you all again for joining us, and have a great day.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.